to negotiate with him. William Jordan, were you caught off guard by those remarks?
No. In fact, I wish everybody would just take a chill pill. Because, in fact, John Kerry has not deviated that much from the standard talking points. In fact, I saw the latest set of talking points late last week, marking the 4th anniversary of the outbreak of what became the Syrian civil war. And those points make very clear and emphasize over and over that the only way out, and this has been the long-standing U.S. position, is a negotiated resolution of this conflict, and now a civil war.
Yeah, but when, for instance, they were talking in Geneva, the U.S. was saying, first Assad has to go.
Well, there are the Geneva principles, and nothing that John Kerry said yesterday contradicts any of that, any of those preconditions or any of those, if you will, absolute requirements in order to have some kind of a negotiated departure for the Assad regime. I mean, to me, yes, some of the directness with which Kerry said what he did may have been a bit surprising, but what he actually said in substance doesn't constitute any significant change in the U.S. position as far as I'm concerned.
Régis Le Sommier, is that the way you read it?
I mean, it's coming on the very anniversary of the uprising in Syria, so it didn't, it didn't say that, he didn't say that out of the blue, you know. I think it's carefully calculated. Of course, there's a talk with Iran on the nuclear today issue. There's also the offensive on Tikrit, which is led by the Iranian. And all this, you know, it comes in a major game, and there's a bigger game than only the serious question. Now, it is definitely a shift because as you pointed, the departure of Assad was a precondition to any form of talk with the regime. I mean, and first there was no talk with the regime, then some element of the regime, and now it's directly talking to Assad. So there's definitely a shift in that. The truth is, the fighting situation is at a standstill. Everybody's trying. I mean, the United Nations is trying to bring some sort of relief to Aleppo especially, but there's no major gain on the ground, and it's been like that for quite a while. So if there is a solution to be found, well, there's going to be at some point they're going to have to talk with the regime itself and to Assad.
Jenny Giovanni?
Well, I agree with William in the sense that there really isn't a deviation from Geneva II. I was at Geneva I, Geneva II. I've worked on both sides of the regime and the rebel side in Syria, as well as the Iraqi conflict, the ISIS conflict. And I think that Kerry is sticking to what he has always said, which is a very wishy-washy approach to it. I think the fact that this is such a betrayal to the Syrian people. That is the main point. And coming this week on the 4th anniversary, when they're basically sandwiched between a regime that is battering them and ISIS. And the revelations last week, which is something we've always known, that ISIS and Daesh and Assad were working together on the oil deals and the EU putting sanctions on them. It just shows that, in a sense, he had a vested interest all along of going along with what ISIS is doing, which is destroying the Free Syrian Army. I think that, of course, we do have to deal with Assad. He is part of the equation. But more importantly, I think more pressure should be put on the external players, on Russia, on Iran,
on Turkey. On Turkey, yeah.
Turkey, yes, but Turkey has, in a sense, I mean, they've opened their borders and let jihadists cross. But really, I think the key here is Iran. And it is interesting what you brought up, the timing of all this, of Kerry's announcement, if you want to call it that, in the same week that he is negotiating in the final phases of the nuclear deal.
Haytham Manna, do you agree that we're witnessing a fundamental shift?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear everything because of the parasite of the Arabic 24. I heard both. But I can tell you that Kerry yesterday said over the table what happened under the table. And we know all that the majority of regional and international forces today don't think that a military solution is possible. And they agreed with us what we said since 3 years, that there is only a political solution for the Syrian crisis. And now I think that the problem is that the old continent, that's mean Little Britain and old-fashioned France, cannot accept the idea that US now don't have any other solution.
Haytham Manna, the French foreign minister,
to discuss with Assad or not. Assad himself composed the delegation of the Syrian government for Geneva II, and all of us know that. Why this hypocrisy to speak about he will not participate or he will participate? Al-Muallim came because Assad asked him to come,
the foreign minister,
to Geneva II. And the same thing will happen for Geneva III, for any political negotiation based in Geneva Communique. And this, I think this idea that with or without Assad is not the essential today. The essential today, we are living in a dirty war. And this war now is not only Syrian, it is regional.
But Haytham Manna, let me ask you to react. Haytham Manna, the French foreign minister, Laurent Fabius, his reaction just a few hours ago in Brussels was to say putting Assad back in the saddle would be a scandalous gift to ISIS. Do you agree?
You know, I said to you 2 years before that the knowledge of your Minister of Foreign Affairs is like my knowledge in Chinese. Unfortunately, now the foreign policy of France is under development vis-à-vis the region. You send some weapons, arms to the moderated opposition. Now 80% of these arms are in the hand of al-Nusra. And you know that. Stop hypocrisy and stop to speak about free army is beautiful. The coalition is the only representative of the Syrian people. This disc is old, very old now. We are in another era, and this era will be in the conference of Cairo next month of the majority of the opposition, the democratic opposition, to form a delegation, a real representative and equilibrium delegation for negotiation based in Geneva Communique.
All right, we've seen
the French cannot understand that the Syrian opposition now in this step.
Right, Régis Sommier.
I agree with what your guests just said about the position of the French diplomacy regarding Syria and the whole region in general, especially to Syria. There is this at the front of the fight against Assad, which has been the position of Laurent Fabius, is something really hard to grasp. When I was in Damascus in November, late November, there were a lot of, not a lot, but there were a few Americans around, you know, and I went through the neighborhood where the embassy was, and they were sort of like cleaning the U.S. embassy. There were some people fixing things, which was not the case of the French embassy and, of course, the Saudi Arabia embassy, which are nearby. So they showed me that. I don't know if they did it purposely in order to show me, you know, that it was that there might be a possibility that the U.S. embassy might reopen. I don't know about that, but definitely there were some U.S. members, and a French parliamentary noticed the same thing when he went more recently to Damascus. So people are doing business over there. They're going, you know, there are already ties. So why is
according to French newspaper Le Figaro, those ties date way back, much earlier than we think, way before those coalition airstrikes.
Absolutely. The link has always been there. With the French diplomatic position, the link has been severe. There has been a complete cut, which is now to our cost, because security-wise, we would like to have some form of at least talk about the current flow of jihadists coming to Syria. We would like to have some information. Definitely our intelligence service, our defense minister want to know more. And without any ties with the Syrian government, you can't have those informations. So I think there is something that is hard to grasp with the current French diplomatic position regarding Syria.
All right, lots of reactions coming in. One on Twitter: no choice but to talk to Assad as U.S.-led policy in the Middle East unravels whole region. How different is his regime to U.S. ally Saudi Arabia anyway? Another interesting point, William Jordan, on last Friday, there was the head of the CIA who made remarks before the Council on Foreign Relations, John Brennan, saying the last thing we want to do is allow the jihadists to march into Damascus. Otherwise put, he's saying our top priority is the jihadists. Assad is second on our list.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, and that's been one of the problems for the U.S. policy for a long time, is that we don't have a clear strategy. We have not had a clear way
and as a result, as Janine Giovanni was saying, we're rewarding Assad for giving that wide berth to the jihadists at the beginning of the uprising.
Well, that may be. I mean, again, going back to the very beginning, I think we made a lot of miscalculations as far as Assad himself was concerned, and his willingness to deal with the opposition and to try to come to some sort of a peaceful resolution of what was escalating and becoming a more and more violent conflict. But I think that over time, I mean, the dithering in Washington over whether or not to arm the rebels, how to arm the rebels, trying to screen the rebels, which rebels, the fact that the Syrian opposition has never been able to coalesce as a viable, meaningful organization in itself, what has happened with the rise of the Islamic State is that now that's all Washington is focused on, much like Europe. Mm-hmm. And in my view, for far less valid reasons than Europe, which has this threat on its doorstep. For the United States, this is a much more vapid, much less clear-cut threat to the United States. The United States has been sucked into leading a coalition of, I hate to say it, contradictory and disharmonious elements, and the only common denominator is fighting ISIS. Or fighting IS. We have lost sight of what's going on in Syria, and to bring it all back around, I mean, whatever all of this stuff is about, secret agents going back in, the embassy being cleaned up, and all the rest of it. The point is, the United States is keeping an arm's length from the Assad regime, but because it has no other way forward. What I think Kerry, what I believe Kerry, based on the talking points that I've seen, is trying to do is he's trying to go back to Geneva. He's trying to find some kind of an internationally led, UN-led process. He's using the royal we in a way that makes it sound like we, the United States, but he means the international community.
And by the way, the Syrian television going big on the story this Monday with President Assad himself talking of the need to rein in, quote, terrorists.
We are always hearing comments like this. We're waiting to see actions. We've had no choice since the very first day. If these changes are positive and concrete, then we welcome them. But they need to stop financing terrorists, stop sending weapons, and stop putting pressure on European countries to do the same.
Giovanni?
Well, remember one thing, though. When Assad and the regime speak of terrorists, they mean anyone that opposes them. They don't just mean ISIS, Nusra. They mean anyone. They used to call the Free Syrian Army terrorists. I think one thing we have to think of now, we're now entering the 5th year. There's 220,000 people that have been killed. We all know the statistics. 4 million refugees outside the country, 9 million displaced inside. Where do we go from here? How do we end a war? If we take this as a modern template of a war, can we use examples such as, let's say, Bosnia, the Dayton Peace Accords? Richard Holbrooke basically bullied Milosevic into ending that war and rewarded a dictator and a killer and froze front lines, but ended the violence. And I think now this is what people are beginning to look at. At what stage do we now say we need to end the violence? Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy, as we know, is the third Special Envoy behind Kofi Annan and Brahimi, both veteran diplomats who've ended other wars. They failed. He can't even, de Mistura has been trying to get a freeze in Aleppo. He hasn't been able to pass that for one day. All right,
the violence isn't working. I'm going to have to cut you off because we have to take a quick break. I want to pick up on this point. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're reacting to remarks made by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry on the 4th anniversary of Syria's uprising, saying, in the end, you're going to have to talk to Bashar al-Assad. We're talking about it with longtime Syrian dissident Haytham Manna of the Scandinavian Institute of Human Rights. He joins us from Geneva. We want to welcome back as well Paris Match deputy editor Régis Le Sommier, who sat down with Assad in Damascus recently, Newsweek Middle East editor Janine Di Giovanni, and William Jordan, former U.S. diplomat who was among his postings included, of course, Damascus. Before we return to our panel, let's cross to the banks of Lake Geneva. All this, of course, taking place, as we were saying in part one of our discussion, as John Kerry and his Iranian counterpart met this Monday, 4 hours in the build-up to next week's deadline for, well, perhaps not a deal, but at least a breakthrough in nuclear talks. Let's cross to France 24's Sanam Chantier in Lausanne. Sanam, did Syria come up in conversation?
Well, we can't say that Secretary Kerry's comments have actually officially come up during the negotiations in Lausanne, but what we can say is I've highlighted two factors. One of them is that the US is finally on the same page as the United Nations, which means that they realize and they acknowledge that the only way they can find a solution to this 4-year domestic conflict is to go to the negotiation table with the Syrians and also to deal with the parties that are very pivotal, that should be around the table, and that, of course, includes the Iranians. Why? Because they have been providing funds, they have been providing arms, they have boots on the ground. But they can't officially do this until there's an actual real détente between Tehran and Washington, and perhaps the negotiations can pave the way for that.
Geneva 1, Geneva 2, those previous Syrian talks, of course, without Iran, which wasn't invited. Now, the talks are supposed to be strictly, as you say, about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Would you say, Sanam Chantier, that Kerry's remarks suggest that Syria could now be part of a grander bargain on redefining relations in the region?
Well, the thing is, you can question whether messages are being delivered here. Well, yes. You can ask whether the two sides are exchanging ideas. That's the Americans and the Iranians. Well, absolutely. But can the authorities actually officially do anything about it? Can they turn and transform these views to real actions? Well, not at the moment. They don't have the authority to do that. We had a number of officials talk about this and say, look, at the moment, all we have on the table are the nuclear deal that we're dealing with. And the only way that they can deal with a serious situation is to put it through the actual channels, the appropriate channels, which are the United Nations and the government in Damascus itself.
The only way at this particular point in time, but do you sense that there is a chemistry growing between the U.S. and Iran?
Well, the chemistry has been growing for some time now. We haven't seen what we're seeing here today. Earlier, we had the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif in a 4-hour bilateral meeting. They were joined by a delegation of energy ministers and the head of Iran's atomic chief agency, and he actually said to us that he seems a little bit more optimistic, of course, as a detente, and we saw that after the interim agreement was signed last year. But we have to see this go a little bit further and go beyond the political will, because they seem to be slightly overcoming these technical issues that have come up again and again, which include the sanctions.
Sanam Chantier, many thanks for that live update from Lausanne, Switzerland. And of course, those nuclear negotiations heading into a crucial stage. Part one of our discussion, Régis Le Sommier, you were talking about the timing of it. Do you think that Syria is now, all right, not officially, as Sanam was saying, in those talks in Lausanne today, but it is part of a grander bargain between the United States and Tehran?
Well, like I said, I mean, there's definitely a redefinition of the alliances in the area with that opening. I mean, created by Obama towards Iran. I mean, there's definitely, if Obama can leave his presidency with some kind of deal over the nuclear issue, Iranian nuclear issue, then that would make him, you know, that's something he wants. And right now, I think the U.S. with the rise of the Islamic State has started to see things differently. When I met with Assad in November, he told me that he was the only one actually fighting ISIS on the ground, and he made it in a way of, you know, if the allies, like he said, we want to see proofs, and he always says that, but he was pointing the fact that he was actually doing the job on the ground. And that there was some form of non-aggression pact between the coalition Air Force and his Air Force when they were bombing Raqqa and other places. So right now we're seeing, I mean, a sort of recognition on the part of the Americans that they have to somehow coordinate. And with Iran, it's the same. What's going on in Iraq? I mean, the U.S. keeps on saying we're talking to the Iraqi army, but in fact, who's doing the maneuver on the ground? It's General Qassem Soleimani and a lot of Iranian quotes, and the Kurds as well. But there's a deep involvement of Iran on the ground. So, of course, on a regional level, the Syrian issue is one part of the bargain, is one part of a redefinition of a, I would say, Iranian-U.S. relation.
Haytham Manna, do you agree?
Yes, I'd like to say something. I published Daesh, l'état de la barbarie in French.
The state of barbarism.
Yes, the state of barbarism. And in this book, I said that to stop terrorism, we need really of all democrats and moderated forces to find a political solution for Syria and in Iraq. If not, we will not be able to stop terrorism. And I think that today, when somebody tell me that Assad is a killer, yes, he is a killer. He killed my brother, more than 40 people of my family, if I don't speak about my people. But our friend in Chile, to stop dictatorship, they discussed with a killer named Pinochet. And I think that if we like or not, we cannot stop the dirty war in Syria by cow. We must do it by points. And the first point is negotiation based in Geneva Communique. In this only way, we can stop with the acceleration of terrorism in a side and dictatorship in the other side.
Haytham Manna, one of the former hostages in in Syria, Nicolas Hénin, a journalist, has just put out a book in which he says he firmly believes that normalizing ties with Bashar al-Assad will send all the moderates into the arms of ISIS. What do you answer to that?
Listen to me. I think that you must read my book, because the UN asked me for a report about Daesh, ISIS, 2 years before. And I wrote a report to UN, and they refused it. They said to me, you gave a lot of importance to Daesh. 2 years after, when Daesh occupied al-Mosul, they sent the 3 specialists from New York to discuss with me what is Daesh, what is ISIS. And I think this idea that ISIS is an instrument of Nouri, of Assad, you must read. I saw them myself in a mission of human rights in Iraq. Since 2003, they began Al-Qaeda and the old officials of the Iraqi army to prepare something, not only against Americans, it was really against Shia, because both of them agree with an idea that Shia will control after the Americans. And this sectarian approach was reinforced by this group of Salafid with a group of fascist, Iraqi fascists of Saddam Hussein, which work together and which have really a good, very good experience in mukhabarat, service of security, intelligence. Very good experience.
Right, but just bring it again, yes. Haytham Manna, by normalizing ties with Assad, are we betraying those who fought against him?
I think that Assad tried to make something against them, but he cannot himself do it and alone. And for that, if there is a real negotiation, he will accept, because he knows that Turkey can stop this hemorrhage of foreigner fighters. Americans will help Assad with the coalition, international coalition. And the moderated forces will be in the same front with the Syrian army against Daesh, ISIS. If not, he cannot win this. And we saw that in 3 battles between the Syrian army in Al-Raqqa and in their zone.
Janine Giovanni.
I think we have to take a very pragmatic approach now, and we really have to begin to look at what will it take to end this war. And if in some way it means talking to Assad, then I think we have to talk to Assad. I think that we know already it will not end militarily, because what we've talked on this program before is that ISIS, you cannot defeat ISIS. You might be able to beat them back in Raqqa or in parts of Iraq or on borders, but the fact is that philosophically, you can't. You can't really challenge the belief that they have. And the recruitment, as we know, has just continued to climb. So I think really the key message here is, how do we end the war? How do we stop the violence? The freeze that de Mistura tried to put into place hasn't worked. Geneva I and Geneva II, both of them we can see it as failures. If what we're trying to get is a transitional government with executive powers, eventually, it has to in some way, simply because the tide has shifted on the ground so much in Syria that so many people who were undecided before, or who were backing the opposition, at that point the Free Syrian Army, have turned and have said, we'd rather have Assad in place than something we don't know, than Daesh.
There's also the question of Lebanon, and there's a much bigger question with Jordan as well, because what if the caliphate extend to Damascus? You pointed out what Brennan said, chief of the CIA, that nobody has any interest in seeing a collapse of the regime at this point, because Lebanon would be wiped out. And when I traveled to Damascus, I went through Beirut and talked to various Christian people over there, and one of them told me, we are with Assad today, but God knows how much we fought against him before. That's the length that took them. They say, we are with him now, but he was one of our steadfast enemy for a long time.
He did protect the Christians Assad traditionally, and his father protected Christians.
That's right. That's right.
But none of this ultimately matters. I mean, the idea of having a negotiated settlement is what everybody should pursue. I've said that as long as I've been coming on this program. But the regime is not inclined to negotiate. This is a regime that is nurtured on the blood or on the milk of steadfastness. This goes back to Bashar al-Assad's father, and this regime is thriving now because it is at war, it is in conflict, it is in mortal combat for its survival. This is the thing that galvanizes the support around it in the areas that are under its control.
Are you suggesting, William, and that brings back to what Janine Giovanni was comparing to Bosnia, where there was a negotiated settlement by hook or by crook? They got one with Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader. but he later wound up in prison and died there. That looking at that example, the Syrians don't want to go down that route. Perhaps
well, I think I think it has nothing to do with other examples. I think this is in the DNA of this regime, and it's primarily perhaps in the DNA of Alawite members, leaders of this regime, but everybody who's associated with this regime, Sunnah, Christian, Druze, whatever. They are all in lockstep and in full agreement because they know that this boat takes everybody down. There are going to be no survivors. The idea of trying to have an intact Syrian state at the end of all of this is laudable. I mean, John Brennan is absolutely right. And John Brennan, and I worked with John Brennan at the CIA, when he was at the CIA and I was at the State Department, coming up with the sort of possible scenarios for what could happen in Syria should something happen to Hafez al-Assad. Almost every one of them were catastrophic. What we're seeing play out is the reality that this regime has so intertwined the Ba'ath Party with all of the elements of the state that you cannot get rid of the Ba'ath Party without getting rid of the state itself. Syria will have to be completely reconstructed, and it is already shattered.
The failure of the
question is, and the immediate question is, what can you do, as Janine and others have said, to try to address the humanitarian suffering and to try to bring some element of peace and stability? But it is not going to last. Nobody should be naive enough to believe that you can, even with Assad involved, negotiate a long-term peaceful transition in Syria. Not enough blood has yet been shed.
Haytham Manna?
Please. I was with Mr. de Mistura 10 days before, and he said to me a very bad sentence for our opposition. He said to me, you have a stupid opposition because Assad accepted my proposition and now you refuse it. I think that Assad now is in a very bad situation. In the Syrian Central Bank, you have only $3 billion. $3 billion. And the allies of the Syrian regime in economical crisis, Iran and Russia. And he cannot rebuild the country. He cannot continue this war. And he is not in a very comfortable place. For that, he will accept, but we must exert the necessary pressure with Russian, with Americans, with regional forces to force him to come, like Kerry said yesterday. We must force him to come.
Haytham, let me ask you, on that point, let me ask you, because William Jordan there was alluding to the fact that in the past there was bloodshed. Assad's father responsible for the deaths of thousands in the city of Hama in 1982. Do you agree that, come what may, there's no going back and leaving office is not an option for Assad?
Listen to me. He is in the presidential palace. Today, he is in a pole position. But in the society, he don't have any popularity. Some people are with Assad because they are afraid from the worst. And if you go in a negotiation with Democrats and moderated people, for people there is an alternative, another alternative, a democratic state, or some steps toward a democratic state. And he will not be popular at all. And I think that if there are really a good position from all the 5 members of the Security Council members to ask Syrians to go immediately to negotiations, Assad will not be able to refuse that. And I said that to Bogdanov also last week. I said, you are responsible. You are responsible because you are speaking about Moscow meeting and you don't say anything about Geneva communique and Geneva 3. You must make everything to go back to negotiation if you like to help.
There has to be more pressure from the opposition.
Syrian population.
But also, we're forgetting something. Assad is winning. we have to take that into account. He is winning.
He is winning.
So he is in a position of power.
In a military sense.
In a military sense, he's absolutely winning.
No, he's not absolutely winning. No, he's not absolutely winning. He's winning only because he is surviving. He is surviving, and he is in a position. No, he's in a position of control over the main parts of the country.
Major gains on the ground by his army in the
Plus,
recent
his
months.
army is under much more strain than anybody can imagine. These points that were made, these points that Haytham Manna made about the financial situation of Syria being dire, about the country being under tremendous stress, are absolutely true. However, this is a regime that is prepared to go down to the end, like Nazi Germany did. Damascus could become the next Berlin. Bashar al-Assad will die,
At this time, we found an ally in Stalin during World War II. And this time around, we have to see it through a different perspective, I think. Because what people are seeing about the rise of ISIS is that ISIS is threatening their way of life, meaning what we saw with the slaughter of the newsroom of Charlie Hebdo at the beginning of this year in France was kind of a wake-up call for people, because the ISIS propaganda has an impact here. And ISIS is threatening our way of life. Assad is not threatening our way of life. This is a big difference. That's a big difference of perspective, or perception from people towards what's going on in Syria today. It has changed. The rise of ISIS has changed the equation so much.
Yes, but
and we still have.
But the question is whether or not Islamic State is going to be able to continue and survive longer than the Assad regime, and I don't think that's the case.
That's the key.
I think that. If there are a number of game changers that could happen here, including what happens in Iraq, including what with the Islamic State, including a change of position on the part of Russia, some sort of, I don't think a grand bargain, but some sort of change of position with Iran. These are things that could influence and could put pressure on the Assad regime to compromise. In the end, what is going on in Syria is mixed up with and has become dominated by what's going on with the Islamic State. But it is not fundamentally about the Islamic State. It is about a dictator who has who's brutalized his people and has created the conditions in which he is witnessing, and we are all witnessing, the destruction of his country.
But we've known from the beginning that Assad absolutely has no scruples about taking his people down with him. We knew that from March 11th, right in the beginning, when he fired into a crowd of peaceful demonstrators. But I disagree with you strongly when you say he's not winning, because I think purely from the fact that we've gone from wanting to bomb Damascus after the Ghouta chemical attack to now,
which would have been a total mistake.
Well, okay, but wait, to now we're actually talking about involving him in negotiations. I think he is winning. I do think he's in a position of power. The people I talk to inside Syria all the time have gone from who is supporting now an opposition, a coalition that's in Brussels and Istanbul and has no correlation to what's actually happening.
And on the ground, is shifting towards the radicals.
Will the international community convene a donors conference to rebuild Syria if Bashar al-Assad is still president, if his regime is still in power? That is ultimately the key question. In addition to whether or not you can secure the...
We're still seeing Aleppo being barrel bombed to hell. So, I mean, we're not... I mean, we need to first stop the violence. We need to first halt the killing and get the humanitarian routes open. Right, we're a long way from reconstruction.
Janine DiGiovanni, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well William Jordan, Régis Le Sommier, Haytham Manna for being with us today from Geneva. Stay with us, though, because our Media Watch segment is next. All right, impassioned discussion, as you can imagine. James Creedon, hello, how are you?